The storm came without warning. March 31st, 1944. Over the waters near Cebu in the Philippines, Admiral Minaichi Koga's Kawanishi flying boat fought a violent storm. Lightning flashed, rain hammered the hull. Within hours, the aircraft was gone. Koga's death left the Imperial Navy leaderless. Even worse, just a day later, another transport plane carrying fragments of the Z plan crashed in the Philippines. Filipino guerrillas recovered the documents. The Empire's most secret strategy had slipped into American hands. But what happens when an empire bets everything on a plan, and that plan falls into enemy hands? To Koga, defeat had always been unimaginable. The Americans, he believed, would attack the obvious targets, crashing into strong points one by one. Tarawa had cost them over 1,000 dead for a single strip of coral. Surely they would repeat that pattern across the Marshalls. Surely Japan's fortresses would hold. What Koga could not know, as his doomed aircraft battled the storm, was that the enemy already held his playbook. American code breakers studied every line, and soon Admiral Chester Nimitz would make a choice that defied everything Koga believed about warfare. In just 4 days, Japan would lose the Marshalls, not because its soldiers fought badly, but because they had prepared for the wrong war. For nearly 2 years, Japan had poured concrete, steel, and blood into turning the Marshalls into a fortress. Jaluit, with more than 3,000 troops and massive coastal guns. Mili, bristling with bunkers. Wocha and Maloelap, reinforced with artillery, minefields, and airstrips. Each outlying atoll was designed to grind down any American advance. It wasn't arrogance, it was doctrine. Since the days of Admiral Yamamoto, Japanese strategy revolved around the decisive battle. You lured the enemy into attacking your strongest positions. You bled him until his resolve cracked. Then the combined fleet would appear to finish the job in one great clash of arms. This was the spirit of Tsushima reborn, the code of decisive victory elevated to dogma. When Yamamoto was killed in 1943, Admiral Koga inherited that legacy. To him, the Z plan wasn't just a strategy, it was scripture. The Americans would grind forward, step by bloody step. Japan would endure. And when the time was right, Japan would strike. But this faith in fortress warfare carried a fatal flaw. It assumed the enemy would think the same way, that Americans, too, believed honor demanded frontal assault, that the U.S. Navy had no imagination beyond brute force. At Pearl Harbor headquarters, however, a very different mind was at work. Admiral Chester Nimitz looked at the same map and saw not a chain of fortresses, but a series of weak points waiting to be bypassed. For him, war was not a duel of courage. It was a problem to be solved with intelligence, logistics, and audacity. The coup came when Filipino guerrillas recovered a crashed Japanese aircraft carrying fragments of the Z plan. Within weeks, American analysts pieced together Japan's grand design. Every fortress, every bunker, every garrison was mapped out. But more revealing than the defenses themselves was the assumption behind them that the Americans would oblige by attacking strength head-on. Reconnaissance confirmed what the plan implied. Kwajalein Atoll, the administrative hub of the Marshalls, the nerve center for all Japanese operations, was shockingly under-defended. Out of more than 5,000 personnel, only about 1,200 were trained combat troops. The rest were Korean laborers, construction workers, and clerks. In January 1944, Nimitz gathered his senior commanders in Pearl Harbor. The map of the Marshalls lay spread across the table. Fortress islands circled in red ink, Jaluit, Mili, Wocha, the obvious targets, the expected sequence. Nimitz put his finger on Kwajalein instead. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are not going to Jaluit. We are not going to Mili. We are going straight to Kwajalein." Even his own staff fell silent. To leap over the outer defenses and strike directly at the core went against every convention of military science. But that was the point. The Japanese had built their entire strategy on predictability. Now, the Americans would weaponize unpredictability. To disguise their true aim, U.S. carriers unleashed a storm of strikes across the Marshalls, hammering Jaluit, Mili, and Malawiilap with bombs and torpedoes. To Japanese eyes, it looked exactly as expected. Methodical, predictable, the same bloody pattern as Tarawa. They could not see the deception. They did not realize that the blow about to fall would erase their forces in just 4 days. While Japanese commanders congratulated themselves for predicting American moves, the U.S. Navy was quietly assembling one of the largest amphibious armadas of the war. More than 40,000 troops, including the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division and the 4th Marine Division, boarded transports at Pearl Harbor. They were supported by a massive fleet, 7 battleships, 11 carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of landing craft. Yet the brilliance of Operation Flintlock wasn't just in the scale of force. It was in the mask. For weeks leading up to the landings, American carrier groups struck targets across the Marshalls. Jaluit, Mili, Malawiilap, every fortress atoll took punishment from the air. To Japanese eyes, it was confirmation of everything they believed. The Americans were preparing to grind forward, island by island, just as they had at Tarawa. But in reality, those strikes were smoke and mirrors. The real blow was aimed at the heart of Kwajalein Atoll. On January 29, 1944, American battleships moved into position inside Kwajalein Lagoon. By the next morning, January 30th, their big guns thundered to life, aimed not at the outer defenses, but at the very heart of Japanese command. When the bombardment began, it was unlike anything the Pacific had seen. The horizon lit up in blinding flashes as the battleships USS New Mexico, USS Mississippi, and USS Colorado unleashed 14-inch shells that turned concrete bunkers into dust. Carrier aircraft strafed and bombed from above, blanketing Kwajalein with explosions. The deception was over. The Americans had bypassed Japan's walls and kicked open the door. Rear Admiral Manzo Akiyama, commander of the 6th Base Force, had spent months assuring his staff that the Americans would come first to Jaluit or Mili. His daily briefings dripped with confidence. The American mind is methodical. They lack imagination. They will strike where we are strongest. But on the morning of January 31st, as shells began to fall across Kwajalein, that confidence dissolved. From his bunker, Akiyama watched the lagoon erupt with muzzle flashes. Battleships were inside the perimeter he had trusted. The guns he had emplaced to cover the seaward approaches were useless. The enemy had not gone past the outer defenses. They had gone around them. Reports crackled over the radio. Airfield under heavy attack. Enemy planes outnumber us 20-1. Zeros falling into the lagoon. We cannot hold. Within hours, 92 of the 110 Japanese aircraft in the Marshalls were gone. The remainder fled to distant bases. Akiyama scribbled in his diary, his words later recovered by American intelligence. Our doctrine has failed. The enemy does not honor the rules. They fight a different war. Around him, chaos spread. Bunkers collapsed under battleship shells. Korean laborers fled in terror. Communications disintegrated. For the first time, Japanese officers confronted an unthinkable reality. Their fortresses had become irrelevant overnight. At dawn on January 31st, American landing craft churned toward the beaches of Kwajalein Island. The shoreline was nothing but blackened rubble, trees reduced to splinters, bunkers shattered. Nothing could have lived through that bombardment, one officer remarked. But some defenders had survived, and pockets of resistance fought with desperation. Machine gunners fired from collapsed pillboxes until naval shells buried them. Suicide charges erupted in the ruins of the airfield. Yet the scale of American firepower was overwhelming. Tanks rolled inland from landing craft. Engineers blew gaps through seawalls. Wave after wave of infantry pressed forward with grim determination. By nightfall, half the island was in American hands. By February 2nd, organized resistance on Kwajalein had collapsed. Nearly 5,000 Japanese were dead. Only a few hundred prisoners remained. American casualties, though painful, were astonishingly low compared to Tarawa. About 177 killed and 1,000 wounded on Kwajalein itself. Meanwhile, to the north, the Marines of the 4th Division stormed Roy and Namur. They faced fanatical counterattacks and deadly ammunition explosions. Within 2 days, 3,500 more Japanese defenders were killed. In just 4 days of combat, more than 11,000 Japanese soldiers had been wiped from the marshals. American losses numbered fewer than 400 dead. It wasn't simply a victory. It was a revelation. Fortress warfare had died on the beaches of Kwajalein. On Kwajalein Island alone, nearly 5,000 defenders were annihilated. At Roy and Namur, another 3,500 were killed. Only a few hundred prisoners were taken. Most fought to the death or were consumed in fiery explosions as ammunition dumps ignited under bombardment. Beyond the immediate battlefields, thousands more Japanese troops remained stranded on the outer atolls. Jaluit, Mili, Woche, Maloelap. Nearly 11,000 in total had been stationed across the marshals, expecting to repel frontal assaults. Instead, the Americans simply bypassed them. Cut off from supplies, surrounded by the Pacific, they became irrelevant. Many would die in the months that followed from starvation, disease, and isolation. To the American public, the victory was hailed as proof of momentum. Newspaper headlines boasted of 11,000 enemy dead for fewer than 400 American lives. For the Japanese High Command, the number was devastating. Not only had they lost thousands of men, they had lost faith in their own doctrine. The fortresses that once bristled with guns had turned into tombs. The Fall of Kwajalein was more than a battlefield victory. It was the beginning of a revolution in the way wars were fought. Island hopping was not about matching strength against strength. It was about making the enemy's strength meaningless. By skipping the fortress islands, the Americans proved they could move faster, strike deeper, and conserve lives. The Japanese had prepared to fight one kind of war. The Americans chose another. For Japanese commanders, the shock was profound. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who replaced Koga after his death in March 1944, read reports that sounded like science fiction. Entire fortress islands left untouched. Garrisons starving while battles bypassed them. The heart of the marshals taken in 4 days. Post-war interrogations revealed their confusion. We built fortresses, they built flexibility. We concentrated power, they concentrated intelligence. We prepared for battle, they prepared to avoid battle entirely. And Kwajalein was only the start. Within months, U.S. forces leapt forward again, seizing the Marianas. From Saipan and Tinian, B-29 bombers could now reach Tokyo directly. Soon came the Philippines, then Iwo Jima, and finally Okinawa. Each leap confirmed the new American way of war. Strike where the enemy is weakest, move relentlessly forward, and let bypass defenders wither away. For Japan, the psychological blow was even greater than the tactical. 1. Officers raised in the tradition of Bushido, trained to see honor in frontal confrontation, now faced an enemy who refused to play by those rules. To them, it felt almost insulting. How do you defend against an enemy who will not meet you head-on? The answer, for Japan, was simple and terrible. You don't. You lose. By February 4th, 1944, Kwajalein was silent. Smoke rose from the ruins. The lagoon was choked with wreckage. Rear Admiral Akiyama lay dead among his men. The administrative heart of Japan's marshal's defense had been erased in less than 100 hours. For the Americans, it was a triumph of intelligence, firepower, and innovation. For Japan, it was the death of an entire way of war. The doctrine of decisive battle, the faith in fortresses, the conviction that courage alone could balance American industry, all of it died on the beaches of Kwajalein. The lesson was brutal but clear. In modern war, it is not enough to be brave. You must be flexible. You must adapt. Otherwise, your strongest positions will become your gravest weaknesses. Today, historians look back at Kwajalein as more than just a battle. It was the moment fortress warfare was buried, and maneuver warfare was born. The cost for Japan was 11,000 soldiers in 4 days. The cost for America was fewer than 400 dead. The contrast could not be starker. 11,000 lives, sacrificed not in decisive battle, but in irrelevance. Standing in the ruins of Kwajalein, surrounded by the wreckage of his shattered command, Admiral Akiyama had no words left. But his surviving officers would later admit what he could not. The Americans had changed the rules, and Japan never recovered. The age of fortresses had ended. The age of island hopping had begun. What do you think? Was Kwajalein the true turning point of the Pacific War? Share your thoughts below. And if you found this story powerful, please like, share, and subscribe so we can bring you more forgotten battles of World War II.